Thanks for staying with us on SABC News. The International Court of Justice is on a 10-minute coffee break, and I'm joined in studio by SABC News UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, so good to have you in studio, not in New York as usual. Just take us through what happened earlier on today in that court.
Nzinga, good to be with you. South Africa, of course, has their first bite of the apple, essentially, making the case, right? South Africa has brought this case to the International Court of Justice, essentially an arbiter in a dispute between two states that are parties to the Genocide Convention of 1948. South Africa is accusing Israel of violating the tenets of that international legal instrument. Israel will present its defense tomorrow, saying that they are not in violation of something they have subscribed to now for decades. So what you saw from the South African legal team, Dr. Advocate Adila Hassim, let me go through what her role was here. She essentially provided the court with what they believe to be Israel's specific acts of genocide. Detailed genocidal acts. She started, first of all, with the killing of Palestinians. That is what she listed as the first genocidal act perpetrated by Israeli authorities, in the main, the Israeli Defense Force. She described Gaza, the size of Gaza. Essentially, this is an enclave about 365 square kilometers large, with 2.3 million Palestinians living, so densely populated area. She talked about the systematic killing of 22,000 plus Palestinians, including militants, but a lot of civilians. She pointed to the fact that 70% of the people that have died in Gaza have been women and children. She pointed to 7,000 Palestinians presumed dead that remain under rubble that is yet to be cleared. She talked about the level of killing that was so extensive that they are buried in mass graves. Israel has deployed, she told the court, 6,000 bombs per week. And that speaks to the extent to which Israel is pursuing Hamas, but also there's a broader conflict here that is affecting civilians as well. So that was the first genocidal act. She then talked about the second genocidal act, the suffering of Palestinians, and told the court that it's undeniable that Israel has inflicted bodily and mental harm on civilians. That is what she labeled as the second genocidal act. She then talked to the third genocidal act. Israel, she said, has deliberately imposed conditions on Gaza that cannot sustain life and are calculated to bring about the group's destruction, Gaza's destruction, and the subsequent destruction of the people that live there. She talked about destruction being celebrated by the Israeli army, the deliberate to cause widespread hunger and starvation. She talked about the crisis levels of hunger. The United Nations, of course, as you well know, has pointed to possible famine and starvation as being existential threats facing the population there. She said, even she pointed to Israel allowing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, but she said they are letting some aid in, but they're creating conditions where the distribution of that aid becomes impossible, right? If you're destroying road infrastructure, if you're destroying buildings, the means to then cross a border with that aid and distribute it throughout the entire enclave becomes impossible. And then the fourth genocidal act, she talked about the military assault on Gaza's healthcare system, including the ramifications it has on on reproductive health, the ability of pregnant women to give birth to their babies. And she pointed to that as a fourth genocidal act, the systematic destruction of Gaza's healthcare system and what that means for the ability to sustain life in the enclave.
And then we also had Advocate Mugadobi SC speaking about intention around genocide and the messages that are coming from the Israeli government and the soldiers as well. They are pointing out a lot of and showing a lot of AV. Just take us through that presentation, and then John Dugard later on.
Yeah, he focused on Israel's genocidal intent. He talked about genocidal rhetoric by Israeli authorities in relation to Gaza. He used examples from the Prime Minister. He played a clip from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He referred to various cabinet ministers, including the Defense Minister of Israel, that has made statements. He talked about the mass displacement of Gazans, the targeting of family homes and civilian infrastructure, the destruction of health infrastructure, mass killing of Palestinians. He used statistics that 1 in 4 Gazans have been injured since October 7th, and that Israeli political leaders, military commanders, have declared their genocidal intent and repeated, and a rhetoric that has been repeated by soldiers on the ground. He quoted from cabinet ministers, various cabinet ministers that he said used language of systematic dehumanization. In quotes I have here, human animals is what he referred to. He also talked about it being commonplace in the military, commonplace in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, in terms of calls for Gaza to be, quote, erased, crushed. One sentence, he said, for everyone there, and inverted commas, we have death. And these are now quotes that he has used from various interlocutors in the Israeli military establishment.
Mm-hmm. So, Sherwin, our understanding was that the appearances, they were going to be 2 hours. They've now been moved to 3 hours. Take us through why that is.
These are complicated arguments to be made. You are literally making a case and accusing a party, a co-party, right? South Africa and Israel are both parties to the Genocide Convention of 1948. And there is a very high bar to be made in terms of accusing and proving, for example, intent, right? That is the thinking of people, using their words against them. And so judges, we don't really see that in the case so far, but often in these criminal tribunals, the Constitutional Court in South Africa, the Supreme Court in the United States, judges sometimes interrupt you and ask questions. That doesn't seem to be happening here. But in terms of being able to really present the case and ventilate all the aspects here, I think there's a very high bar required from South Africa, particularly as it pertains to the provisional measures they are seeking in this case. But equality matters. So if you give 3 hours to the South Africans, you will then afford the Israelis 3 hours as well. But a complicated issue. There is a very high bar in terms of proving that Israel is in fact guilty of genocidal intent. And I think, more time to ventilate the issues, give everybody the chance to make their arguments.
It was my understanding that also Israel may have asked for that extra time in order to put forth their arguments, and then in terms of fairness, and South Africa was also given that chance, and we'll see if they're going to use all 3 of those hours. We also saw the ambassadors and our justice minister there before Dr. Adila Hassim SC started presenting. There's quite a lot of at stake here, and there's quite a lot of media interest from the South African contingent and beyond.
Well, the instructing force here, right? You're an advocate in the making. You understand an instructing force is the government, essentially. And that's why you saw South Africa's Ambassador Vusi Madonsela make the opening statement. It was followed by Justice Minister Ronald Lamola. And that tells you about the political nature of this event. This is not just a legal affair. This is a state going up against a state. And it's the interlocutors at the very highest level of those states that will be represented in that court. And so South Africa being represented by cabinet ministers at the very highest level, but it is the lawyers, it is the advocates in the room that will essentially be making this case. And Israel, of course, will also have its opportunity to defend itself, right? And what are some of the arguments you might hear from the Israelis? They will talk about their right to self-defense. They will talk about the atrocity crime that Hamas perpetrated against the Israeli state, particularly targeting civilians. There were 1,200 deaths on October 7th, and so they will say that is what precipitated Israel's response. But you will also hear words like collective punishment. What is proportionality in terms of international law? And the arguments that you are hearing from the South Africans is that Israel is not proportional in its response, not to diminish what happened against the Israelis, but is this a proportional response to destroy a healthcare system, to destroy 60 to 70 to 80% of family homes, civilian infrastructure? Where are these people going to return to? And so they're making the broad case here that by destroying this infrastructure, by targeting en masse the population in Gaza, Israel's intent, Israel is perpetrating genocidal acts that will lead to the destruction and death of these populations, because if you don't have a place in which to live, and you are unable to leave this enclave, right? They don't have free will to leave Gaza. They are imprisoned essentially in an open air prison. And the case South Africa is making is that the acts will lead to death, and that, in essence, is genocidal intent as far as they're concerned.
Sherwin, take me through what action is hoped for by the South Africans, and then also what may happen, as we've heard the United Nations, we've heard the World Health Organization, South Africa presenting the case that they've raised the alarm about what is happening in Gaza and saying that there's been impunity on the part of Israel.
Yeah, so the question essentially is what happens next once all arguments have been made and the court now deliberates. The court could come back within a matter of weeks and provide a provisional relief in terms of what South Africa is seeking, and South Africa is asking for an order that orders Israel to essentially stop military action, because while it ventilates the broader questions about whether genocide is being perpetrated against the Palestinians. But even if the court were to tell Israel to stop, there have been other organs of the United Nations. Remember, the ICJ is an organ, judicial body of the United Nations. The judges are elected by both the General Assembly and in tandem with the Security Council. That's the judicial organ. Then you have the General Assembly, the Economic Social Council, the Security Council, and of course the Secretariat. And you've heard various other organs of the United Nations already pronounce itself, right? The Secretary General has called for a permanent ceasefire. The General Assembly, by 155 votes in favor, have called for a permanent ceasefire, for humanitarian access at the scale at which is required, and of course also for the hostages to be released. None of that has essentially happened. And so what you will have here is clarity from a legal tribunal that is legally mandated to pronounce on issues of whether genocide has happened or not. They will provide clarity. But whether it's going to change the calculus on the ground, whether it's going to change Israel's position, whether Israel is going to comply with a binding ruling by the court remains an open question, because there are other avenues through which binding resolutions have been passed against Israel, including in the Security Council, which Israel has ignored. So unless there is enforcement, which is lacking, the UN doesn't have a standing military that can enforce a decision by its highest court. The Security Council is not going to impose sanctions on Israel as a result of non-compliance. Why? Because the United States has a veto right there. So we will have clarity in terms of what Israel is doing, whether it amounts to genocide or not, but whether it actually changes Israel's behavior is a matter that only Israel probably knows the answer to.
And we know that there's lots of lobbying push. We saw Anthony Blinken visiting Israel, speaking to the Palestinian president as well. Not only in the courts are people trying to intervene from outside of Israel, but their allies as well.
Well, this is a complicated business. Geopolitics is very complicated. You have, national bilateral interests. The United States at one point had sent a strike military force into the Mediterranean, two massive frigates with the ability to wage war, at very short notice. There's the concern of the conflagration of this conflict. You have military strikes happening across the border with Lebanon. There have been instances where Israel has targeted individuals in Syria. And so Anthony Blinken is essentially there talking to everyone because they don't want this to become a more regional conflict. But you have many vested interests. If you understand the Palestinian cause over the last 7 decades, you'll understand that a number of Palestinians don't only live in the occupied Palestinian territories. They live as refugees in Syria. They live as refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon. And so for decades, people are very attached in that region to the plight of Palestinians because it has been such a long-standing issue that has not been resolved in the international community. And the more, the decades have passed, the less viable this notion of a two-state solution, right? That's kind of the banner that is flashed around the world, the two-state solution. We still believe in the two-state solution, but the geography has changed in the last decades. Israeli settlements have expanded in violation of international law. So when you talk about a two-state solution, where is the Palestinian state going to be given the expansion of the Israeli state? At a loss for the Palestinians. So these are very big, broad, integrated questions. And in that region, there is a national understanding in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, of the Palestinian plight, because for the last 7 decades, many Palestinians have lived and grown up in those national jurisdictions.
Sherwin, when you speak about the geopolitics, South Africa, a country that many say is punching way above their weight, taking this matter on and going to the ICJ when others didn't. Talk to me about the perceptions around South Africa, both internally and I think by the international community as well, around this action to go to the ICJ.
I mean, I guess South Africa is the BRICS chair at the moment. The geopolitical sands have been shifting while President Ramaphosa has chaired this new and growing in power and stature geopolitical bloc. They're talking about BRICS being a rival to the G7. So perhaps South Africa using its chairmanship and its close relationship with the Palestinian Authority. Do not underestimate how close the ANC government has been, because they share a similar history in a sense, right? South Africa, I mean, when you talk about Hamas, for example, the ANC had an armed wing known as Umkhonto we Sizwe that also perpetrated acts on occasion against civilians in South Africa to highlight the cause and the struggle. So there is perhaps a broader understanding in South Africa of the Palestinian cause. And you saw very quickly the Organization for Islamic Cooperation came out in support of the South African application. But as to the why, I think that's an open question the South Africans need to explain. Who were they talking to behind the scenes? Was this a request by the Palestinians? Why didn't this come from the Islamic states? Why was this coming from South Africa? But there has been a long-standing close relationship between the ANC and the Palestinian Authority.